Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third episode. In this episode, we'll be hosting Pahini Pandya, who's the CEO and co-founder of Panakia Technologies. She completed her PhD at King's and did her postdoc at Cambridge University and then transitioned into entrepreneurship. So welcome, Pahini, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks a ton for having me, Akila. I'm really delighted to be here.
So Pahini, just to start off, what made you go into academia in the first place, and how was your journey there?
That's a very interesting question with a very long-winded answer. It's my journey to academia started as early as when I was 8 years old, when I basically one day went up to my parents and said, I have decided I'm going to be a scientist. And my parents were like, okay, that's great. And then out of curiosity, they asked, why not a doctor or an engineer? And I said, well, engineer, fair enough. Doctors, I usually end up helping a few hundred patients. And by promoting science and furthering knowledge, the boundaries of knowledge and developing new innovations, you can make huge changes and affect millions of lives, if not billions. So that's pretty much what I wanted to do since I was 8 years old. And I thought academia allowed me to not only engage my curious side, but also at the same time, it allowed me to create impactful innovations very specifically in healthcare, which is also why I chose academia and science. And then eventually the field in which I would specialize was solidified with a few different events much closer to home when I lost my childhood best friend to cancer during my undergrad. And that's where I realized the impact that it had on me. And it made me realize that this is probably one of the spaces that I really wanted to spend my time working on, given the complexity of the disease and given the amount of challenges that doctors face when treating cancer patients. So that's how I ended up applying to King's for my master's. So I did an undergrad in biotechnology in India, and then I moved to the UK for my master's. I picked King's specifically because I wanted to do biophysics. And one of my role models was Rosalind Franklin. So I wanted to work in the same department where she did her research. So I ended up at King's, and that's where I pursued my PhD as well, which was, again, very focused on cancer research, translational cancer research, and continued that during my postdoc.
Thank you so much, Pahini, and that personal, impact that you want to create, given, the history that you've had with cancer. That's really, great to hear. So what motivated you to switch to the AltAcc track? I mean, academia has a lot of opportunities to do these sort of innovative discoveries. You have wonderful labs working when you work in academia. So what prompted you to pivot?
Yeah, so I think you'll realize when I give this example that I'm a person who's very much driven by what impacts me in my life and very focused on solving challenges. So it was again an incident which hit home when I was in my second year of my PhD. I had my own personal cancer scare. So I was working on cancer research. I was trying to understand, what are the complexities and what can we do to treat cancers better. So I knew the stats and everything else, and I was waiting for either a confirmatory cancer diagnosis or an all clear for a whole month. I kept going back and forth to the hospital, to the oncologists. They would, take biopsies and then run them. And then every time I went back, the results were inconclusive. So that was quite a very, very isolating experience for me. It was very scary because I couldn't speak to anyone about it because I didn't know if I had cancer or not. I didn't know how I would talk to my family about this or my friends. And it was also very, very scary because every day I would go to work and I would be reminded of the statistics. So every day that I was waiting, if I had cancer, then, I was inching closer to a worse outcome. And one of the incidents that I remember very vividly was sitting in the waiting room with the patients and I was talking to this lady who had breast cancer that had spread all across to multiple different organs. And the optimism with which she was talking about, and the hope that she had in her doctors and her care team that they would find something that would cure her, really, really made me realize that cancer doesn't wait for anyone. And the reason why I wanted to get into academia was I wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And it was at that point where I realized that I wanted to make a difference in a much more realistic or faster timeframes than what academia allowed, but I still wanted to be at a much, much bigger scale. So I started looking for opportunities which would allow me to translate my scientific expertise into real world applications. And I took a quite a structured approach, explored a wide variety of options, and realized that startups were the way forward. So that's how I ended up then taking a journey, which eventually led to Panacea.
Okay, that's super great to hear. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story as well. It does take a lot of courage. So we appreciate you sharing that with us. So how did you find out about the startup side? Was it, your personal research? Did you speak to people? How did you go about it? You said you had a very structured approach. So I think our listeners would benefit to learning from you.
Yeah, so shortly after I had my cancer scare, in the last couple of years of my PhD, I started looking at opportunities. And at that point in time, this was quite early, before, moving out of academia was reasonably acceptable. Let me put it that way. I still think that there is that mindset that if you're not in academia, you're not a great scientist at times, but it's slowly changing. But at that point in time, it was much worse. There were not that many initiators, but I identified a few different key initiatives, including some consultancy groups, some entrepreneurial ecosystem organizations like Innovation Forum. A lot of them were quite grassroots led. So I got involved in a range of these organizations, which allowed me to get an understanding of what were the options at least. So very quickly, I realized that three of the most viable options for me would probably be around strategy consulting, industry, or startups. And then what I've worked on was trying to understand what really motivated me. Why did I want to work in the space, and why did I like academia so much? So I realized that one of the things that really, really excited me was the fact that I was working on problems that were meaningful to me, that I genuinely cared about. I was dealing with a wide variety of problems and complex challenges on a daily basis. So no day-to-day was same. And at the same time, it also required you to have a structured approach towards problem solving. And finally, I think it was more around me being able to use my scientific as well as soft skills into other spaces. So these were just some of the key requirements that I had when I was looking at it. And what I found was startups perhaps gave me the best fit, where I could apply all three and reasonably make a bigger impact that I wanted to achieve. So that's the route that I decided to take. And I joined, I did several different pieces of work, but eventually I ended up joining Entrepreneur First, where I met my co-founder.
Okay, that's great. And just going back to the skills aspect. So you mentioned that you use a combination of your scientific skills as well as soft skills. So I'm focusing on the soft skills here because that's what our listeners sort of want to know. So what soft skills would you say would help you to transition successfully into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I think the reality is entrepreneurship, especially within life sciences and bio, is not very different from what you would be doing within your PhDs. So one of the key areas, the way I thought about it was, okay, we normally need to, in order to start any project, and I take this as a project, in order to start any project, you need funding, right? So what do you need to do in order to get funding? You need to identify sources of funding. You need to have some preliminary data, which would allow you to build a case on what's the problem you're solving, why you're solving it, how are you going to solve it, and what are your expected outcomes. So those, we are very good at actually thinking about how to get funding, how to manage those budgets, and how to project manage, right? So these are some of the key criteria that I realized were very easily translatable. The science obviously was translatable in coming up with solutions. Then when you go at conferences where you give presentations, where you're talking to a diverse audience, and if you have been engaged in talking to science about science to the wider public, you already have skills which allow you to communicate and market to a much broader audience, or a variety of audience, and tailor your messaging based on who you're talking to. So those are just some of the skills that I realized were very simple, very translatable. I was lucky enough to have worked in a lab that was very, very collaborative, but also my engagements with these various different organizations, the grassroots organizations. I even worked with a couple of startups part-time during my postdoc, and worked with Epoch, which is an organization for entrepreneurial postdocs in Cambridge. So it allowed me to build this ability to work with a wide variety of teams, but also lead a range of different teams on different projects. So these were some of the other soft people skills that I was able to translate when founding my startup. Yeah, I would say these are just some of these the basic things that we tend to take for granted, but they're absolutely critical.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting those. A lot of people who transition think that they do not have these skills already, but like you mentioned, project management, working collaboratively, that's something that comes naturally when you're in as a PhD student. So it's quite interesting. And also getting involved in other initiatives, I think that's something you highlighted. So with Epoch, for example, so there are lots of initiatives in any university where we can sort of develop on the skills that we don't use as much in our PhDs. So I think the next question is about your experience at Entrepreneur First. So how was that? How was the application process? And given that it's, you don't really have to have a business idea when you go into it, how did that work out? How did you meet your co-founder?
Yeah, so contrary to a lot of people who actually join EF as, fresh out of university and straight into entrepreneurship, I actually spent a fair amount of time during my postdoc dabbling in entrepreneurship on the side. Not only did I work with startups, but I also attempted to at least work on a startup on the side. So we pitched at one of the venture creation weekends. We did get a lot of traction and interest from the right sort of strategic partners and customers, which then allowed us to validate the idea, think of how we would grow the business and take the business forward. But what happened at that point in time was I was willing to jump on board and move with the idea full time, but my co-founder unfortunately had certain life circumstances which did not allow her to do that. So at that point in time, the good part was we were open enough with each other to realize that, hey, we couldn't take this forward together as a team, and that it made sense for us to focus on what each of us wanted to do at that point in time. So when I joined EF, I already had a very, very clear idea that I wanted the right sort of co-founder who would have complementary skills to myself. And at the same time, had the sort of personality that I could gel with, work with. I would love to hang out with the person outside of work as well, right? And was at the right stage in life to be able to found a startup. So this is where Entrepreneur First really helps, because it does enable people to actually, at least financially, to a certain degree, not have to worry about founding a startup. So it allowed me to achieve two of the things. And of course, finding the co-founder is a little bit of a luck but it's also something that you can work through systematically. So I applied to EF, I got in, and I started the program. The program at that point in time had first 8 weeks of team building, followed by about 3.5 months of idea validation and startup building before demo day, where you would then pitch to investors and go on to raise funding. So during the first 8 weeks, the way the program works is they encourage you to form teams quickly, work on ideas and with co-founders very quickly, and figure out as soon as possible whether you are the right team or not. So they create artificial constraints, which creates, stress and pressure, which allows you to then figure out whether you're working well or not, and whether you're able to progress quickly enough. So there are some things that they told us to look out for was around, the founding team fit. So how is the founding team? What's the sort of progress that you're making? How quickly is it? It shouldn't be additive, it should be multiplicative. And then the founder idea fit. So how uniquely are you two as individuals positioned to be able to solve the problem that you're solving with the solution that you intend to build? So those were some of the things that they ask you to look at. So I joined the program, took a very scientific approach to this. So I made a list of people with the sort of backgrounds that I was expecting them to have, who had interest in healthcare, went through them, interviewed all of them, made a shorter list, and then said, okay, I want to work with, some of these people. My current co-founder was at the top of my list, actually got snapped up within the first hour of the program starting. That's how quickly he got snapped up. I then joined teams with another co-founder who also was equally strong. We both started working on ideas. We made a great team. We started realizing what exactly EF was talking about, and we made significant progress. But 3 weeks in, we realized that we both wanted to work on very slightly different things, and together we were not the best team to address either one of the ideas. So we said, okay, this is the time of maximum opportunity. Let's break up. Let's see if we find our co-founders. If both of us don't end up finding the right co-founders, we can always form a team together. So we broke up. I went on to have another team, which was quite short-lived. And then eventually, at one point, my co-founder and I were both out of teams. We were both talking to multiple people, realized that we both worked very, very well over a Saturday afternoon. And very critically, we had very, very specific expertise in a very niche space. So not only had we built a friendship over the several weeks that the program was going on, but we also realized we ticked a lot of the complementarity boxes, and were able to actually have multiplicative progress. So that was something which was very, very obvious from day one. So we formed the team together and started working on Panakia. That was a little bit of the journey in terms of finding my co-founder.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because normally people think, oh, you just find a co-founder in your circle and then just start working with them. But joining a program such as EF, where you get put into teams, and then, like you said, you work on a project, then you possibly break up, and you're open to that possibility. That's super important, because the person you're starting a business or a startup with, it's super important that you're both on the same page. And like you said, you have complementary skills. So that's definitely a very interesting insight. And I'm sure our listeners will also be appreciative of what you shared, and perhaps they might be motivated to apply to EF in the future. So just, moving to the present moment. So how has your experience been from when you started? What do you feel? How have you grown as a person from then to now? We were discussing earlier about how you're, raising funds at the moment. So you're talking to investors. So how has the journey been from the early stage startup to possibly a more, as you're maturing over the years? How has the journey been for you as the CEO?
Yeah, so I would say the amount of growth that I've had in the last 3.5 years is nowhere close to the amount of growth that I had when I spent my time in academia. It's that much accelerated. It's literally that. And this especially comes from having been in a VC funded startup, right? So initially when we started, it was just me and my co-founder working on an idea. We had some proof points, which we knew were absolutely critical. And then at that point in time, our biggest concerns were, oh, does the tech work, right? Can we actually build something that works? Does the biology work? Does the tech work? And can we actually convince people to take a leap of faith and invest in us so that we get the funds, which would allow us to build a team so that we can start bringing this to life. And at that point in time, we focused a lot on being able to communicate very complex scientific and technical concepts to people who had no background experience at all. So that initially the focus was a lot of that, but then once we got the funding, then the focus changed massively. You not only had to figure out, what was the right way to use the funding. You had a plan, but as we all know, having been in academia, plans don't always work. So what you essentially end up having is a very scientific framework of, okay, this is your hypothesis, this is how you're going to validate it. If it doesn't work, these are some of the variables that you change so that you can figure out how you can eventually get to an answer, right? You either prove or disprove a hypothesis, and if you disprove it, then you come up with a second hypothesis, which makes sense and allows you to progress in the direction that you ultimately want. So a lot of the focus began on developing these frameworks, implementing them, and then creating teams. So actually getting people in. In the initial instance, it was great because we were a team of about 4 or 5 people. It was pretty much like a family. We were all working together from the same office, and then COVID hit. And all of a sudden, we had to very quickly implement and say, okay, we are going to go remote. We're going to change all our systems overnight in less than a week so that we don't lose continuity. And we had to work together as an entire unit. And that allowed a different level of personal growth, both in terms of problem solving, but also people skills and relationship management, right? You realize the level of trust that you need to have with different people, the level of responsibility each one of us had to take. And then over the time, as the businesses started growing, now not only are we thinking in terms of, okay, what are the different skills or what are the things that we are actually missing based on the business needs? Who do we need to bring in? And how do we put together an organization that functions as a business or functions as a company? What this means is you then start thinking, at least in case of my role, I start thinking more and more about who are the right people who would be able to then grow and build their own departments as the company scales. So it's thinking a lot about the future, planning a lot about the future, and then also obviously communicating that with different stakeholders and ensuring that people have the right sort of resources and the support that they need in order to be able to deliver amazing products that actually can save lives.
Thank you so much for sort of taking us through that journey. One thing I wanted to just discuss a bit more on was, how did you manage to get that people management skills? Because we're not trained in that formally in academia. So when you, for example, you said, oh, you had a small team, you were all a family, and that's possibly easier. But when you had to strategize and think about what skills you're missing, and of course you want to retain employees as well. So how did you go about that? Did you take up any courses, or did you learn from others, or did you do something else? We would love to know.
Yeah, so my journey has not been as organized, and I would say I'm not an expert, right? I still am learning, and there is a long way to go, and the skills will change as the company grows as well. But one of the things I always had when I was, even before I joined my PhD, was I really liked to work with people and build relationships. So for me, at times when I was doing my PhD, I felt that the collaboration wasn't enough. What that meant was I ended up, to build my own skills, I ended up taking a lot of PhD students, or I ended up mentoring master students. So I had at least 6 different master students. There were quite a few of them who were working together at the same time in my lab when I was doing my PhD, but also did similar things when I was working with a whole range of the other organizations that I was involved with. So it allowed me to not only mentor individuals or manage individual people and projects, but also teams of varying sizes and in different contexts. So I had some basic skills, but once we started moving more into a startup, I would say startup is like raising a baby, and it takes a whole village to raise a baby, which means you never do it alone. So one of the things we did was surround ourselves with some amazing mentors who actually help us in being more aware of ourselves, and helping us build the type of skills that we need. So you'd need different mentors at different stages. You may need coaches. It's also very critical to surround yourself with a network of peers, so other founders, to share stories and understand how their learning evolves and what are some of the things that may apply to you, or some of the ideas that you can get just from somebody applying something to a certain situation. And most importantly, I would say the biggest source of learning has been from the team themselves. It's a two-way conversation, and what I usually tend to do is I always ask my team members is like, how do you like to work? What is working for you? What is not working for you? And that on its own is a very simple but an effective exercise, if done regularly, allows you to build very strong relationship and allows you to have good people management skills.
Yeah, I think 2 themes I picked up from that were about the importance of mentoring and building that community around yourself, and also about the two-way communication. So you mentioned how you need to understand what your team members want and try to give them the best possible environment for them to thrive. So my next question is going to be a bit more broader. Yeah. So why the UK for startups? I mean, the US is the hub for biotech, and that's what we keep hearing. So why did you choose to stay in the UK, and what support have you received from the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I would say UK is a great place, especially to be a first-time founder. So when I came to the UK, this was more than 12 years ago. I came in with the vision of, pursuing science, because UK is known for its excellence in science. I knew I wanted to, work at King's. I knew I wanted to do my research at Cambridge. So these were like things that I had very clear in my head. And there were very specific reasons for those. When I started entrepreneurship, the only reason why I was able to transition into entrepreneurship was because I was in the UK at that point in time doing a PhD here. There were at least opportunities and programs, which if I was somewhere else, perhaps I wouldn't have had access to. You do have similar programs in the US. There are quite a lot of universities which run programs here. So I actually ended up doing something called Stanford Ignite, which is Stanford's entrepreneurship program. So I did build my foundations in a very systematic way. What I did eventually realize was, when you're thinking of doing a startup, it's never too early to start, but it's always too late. So you might as well just start doing and start learning on the job. And I mean, one of the biggest reasons why Panakia exists is because of programs like Entrepreneur First. I wouldn't have founded my co-founder otherwise. Entrepreneur First has its mission of enabling entrepreneurship outside the Silicon Valley, right? And it's founded in UK, headquartered here in London, which already made it a lot more accessible for an immigrant founder here with not as many networks. But also one of the things is I had much more networks here than I do in the US. So it just made a lot of sense for me to start here, because it gave me that foot up. Founding a company or registering a company is very simple in the UK. It literally takes 15-20 minutes. It's by far the easiest registrations that you have compared to a lot of other countries. Then if you think in terms of an ecosystem perspective, there's a range of other accelerators and programs which also support you through different stages of the journey. So in our case, UK has a very strong healthcare focus as an ecosystem. You're dealing with NHS, which despite being a single entity, also has very different routes, multiple routes through which you can get innovation into the healthcare system. It has its own programs like the Digital Health London Accelerator that we're currently a part of, which supports you to actually access the NHS much better. And then, of course, funding is much more available in the UK than it is, let's say, for instance, in Europe. Even access to, when you think Europe, if you're thinking from a market perspective, it's multiple different markets. So each different market has its own characteristics and own different ecosystems, which have different degrees of maturity. So outside the US, UK is definitely one of the best places to found a startup because you can start it quite quickly, quite rapidly. One of the things that is currently going on is a huge piece of discussion around how we can make UK a great place for startups for the long term, because one of the challenges oftentimes comes when you're thinking of scaling and then getting access to the right sort of capital and ecosystems to be able to scale businesses to the levels that you need. That at the moment still is more concentrated in the US, but there are strong initiatives in UK which we hope will change that in the near future.
So I think that's really great because usually we don't hear so much about the UK. So again, thanks for sharing that. And I resonated with the fact that, you're an immigrant founder, and usually people think that's a huge barrier to found a business, but it's great to hear that you've had a good experience, and generally it seems to be a positive sort of, it's moving quite positively towards being a good area for startups to come up with their ideas and drive innovation. So I think that's a good perspective to hear for our listeners as well. So finally, to close off, I think this is a bit of a big question. So I'm just going to flag that up in advance. What advice would you give to your past self or to others in your shoes, someone who's doing a PhD or a postdoc and thinking about entrepreneurship? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think that's a very big question. But I think one of the things I already said was like, it's never too early to start. Just start, and you can always learn on the job. So that's one of the things, especially for entrepreneurship. I would say the second thing, which I have to keep reminding myself every now and then, but it is an innate characteristic that you should work on developing, is perseverance. You should be perseverant. And the third thing is ask. Don't be afraid to ask. If you don't ask, you will never know if somebody would have replied positively, right? What's the worst case? You'll get a no. But if you don't ask, you'll never know.
I think that's very sound advice, and especially the asking, because sometimes I feel as PhDs, we feel like we need to find the answer ourselves. But when we have, loads of people with a lot of expertise around us, then it makes sense to tap into their knowledge. So thank you so much, Pahini, for coming and speaking with us today. It's great to hear your insights, and we wish you all the best for the upcoming funding rounds.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it and very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.